I want to turn now to young people, America's most reliable non-voters. Now, Americans tend to preserve their voting chastity until their 30s, which of course makes conservatives very happy. Stay pure, young people. Save your vote for your husband, right? But I think this year could be different. Here to talk about that is actress, producer, and change agent Yara Shahidi. Welcome, Yara. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's so great to see you. I was like, who's this grown woman on my show?
I know, we're just recounting. I think the first time we had met, I was 13.
It's crazy. That's actually my first question, because you've been speaking out and speaking for like a lot of these important issues for a while now, and I want to know, what happened to that shy little girl that I cast at that, as that narcissistic, materialistic teenager? Where did you get all this activism from? Yes, exactly. Where did this activism come from?
Well, I mean, honestly, I do genuinely credit Blackish because I come from a really humanitarian family. You've met most of my family.
Yes, I have.
If not the entire, tree.
Yes.
But I come from a family that's always talked about civil rights. I've had a grandfather at the forefront of the civil rights movement within his community.
Yeah.
And so there was always an expectation that regardless of where you ended up in the world, that somehow you're going to orient your job towards social justice. But the reason why I think Blackish was so pivotal is that I don't know in any other situation a time where they would have handed a 13, 14-year-old a mic to say, what are your takes on police brutality?
Right.
If I wasn't on a show that was already starting that conversation. And so I think really the transition was that moment in which I was able to have these conversations that were already happening privately, really publicly, because of the nature of what we were covering. And then I think people got used to just hearing me talk.
Yeah.
So then they were like, well, what else do you want to talk about?
Yeah, you were always so thoughtful. I know Kenya and I noticed that from the beginning. You were always talking about finishing school and the way you talked about it. And I wanted to ask you about Gen Zers, if I can lump you guys. What's happening right now? There are more young people like you that have the same sense of urgency, or do you think there's more Gen Zers who have the cynicism, where they feel like their generation has been left with table scraps?
I feel like it's a fair mix of both, quite honestly. And I think one informs the other. Feeling like we've been left with table scraps, feeling like, okay, well, climate change is now a pressing issue that will affect us within our lifetimes. All of these issues of racial justice, of immigration, are things that affect us. I think the one thing I have noticed of Gen Z, and I hope I'm not just making an observation true of my friend group, but I feel like for the most part, we have these wider networks.
Yeah.
So whether an issue directly affects us, we have more of a tendency to care deeply because more than likely we do know somebody in our immediate circle who is of that identity group or of that intersection. And so with that being said, there is a level of urgency created from the cynicism. And I feel like it is an interesting task of well, how do we make this cynicism productive? How can we use that feeling to be like, okay, we already know that depending on how many electoral votes your state has, for some reason, votes are diluted because of gerrymandering, whatever the issue may be.
Right.
But then what is our general action plan? And I think that's where Gen Z and just how vast our network is really does come into play, because there are some people that are galvanized to take to the polls. There are some people that are like, okay, well, I'm going to be actively protesting. We saw over 100 days of sustained protest against racial injustice. And so all of that, I feel like, adds up to create a beautiful, just kind of groundswell of action in every space.
Yeah, and as a woman of color in the business and out in the world, I've noticed that you seem really conscious about the Black and brown issues that face our community too. Do you feel a certain responsibility about that, or it's like, hey, that's what's there, that's just what I got to do?
Well, I call it a sense of really indebted gratitude, if I could try and name it.
That's great. That's great.
And yeah, it's something that I've reflected on just from even having within my own family, the people who quite literally fought for my rights, and then I think expanding that to think of the, insurmountable amount of people of many generations who fought for my rights, whether or not they knew me personally. I am definitely the result of a work that people knew had to be done, regardless of whether it was a future that they were guaranteed the ability to see.
Yeah.
And I think because of that, there is a deep sense of care, being Black and Iranian, and constantly trying to figure out what that means in different spaces, wanting to, at the very least, continue to be of service, because what we do know, unfortunately, is that the idea of justice and progress is never stagnant, and just as much as we can go forward with inaction, we can go backwards. And so I like to think of, I believe it was Brittany Packnett who had said something on a collective call we had together of saying, to be socially engaged, it's like going on a moving walkway and you have to actively run the other way. It's not enough to just kind of stand still.
Yeah, and she's been on the ground floor of movement. She was in Ferguson, when all that erupted, it was at the beginning of Black Lives Matter. Tell us about, when you sat down, we noticed your T-shirt, the We Vote Next, which I know is, yeah, there it is, yeah. Tell us about that. Is this something that you started?
Yeah, so I started We Vote Next really inspired by the 2016 election because I was too young to vote. I could bring my parents to the polls, but it felt like that was about the extent of it. And I feel like the feeling that it evoked was feeling like the government was something that happened around me rather than with me. And what we know to be true is that level of disenfranchisement, unfortunately, doesn't go away when you magically become eligible to vote because of the structures at play. And so part of it was like, well, can we create an organization where we at least can grow together and begin to understand how these systems are in place together? And so inspired by the fact that we had a midterm election in 2018, which was my first election I could vote in, it was like, well, how do we engage young voters who care about just so many different issues to come into a room together and to be extremely honest about what we know and what we don't know, and without any sense of shame, be able to be empowered when we go to the polls.
Yeah, I saw your interview with Stacey Abrams. It was inspiring to see how passionate you guys were. You were like sisters who hadn't talked in a while, right? I'm sure it felt that way. And it's funny how somebody like that, they kind of inspire you to want to do more and everything. Have you thought about, like, once this election is over, like, how do you connect with young people to let them know that civic engagement continues after moments like this?
Well, what's funny is I feel like this is actually a sentiment that's widely shared by young people, especially because of what we've gone through in these summer months. Not to say that racial injustice was something invented in February, but we've almost moved so far past where our ballot is in the past some months alone. And so it's been an interesting conversation. And I think there's so many youth leaders and leaders in general who have done such a great job at talking about the fact that voting is to be used as an active tool. It's never going to be perfect. But like you're saying, knowing that civic engagement is a daily task, it means that election isn't an end date, but really a start date. And what we want to do is make sure that the tools and the people that are in office are ones who will at least work along with us as we get to whatever that future looks like.
Yeah, it's people knowing that it's not just that their vote matters, it's their involvement matters, and for people to sense that involvement. What are your top maybe 2 or 3 issues for you personally? If you could wave your magic wand, or maybe it's just one issue in particular.
That's really difficult to say. I feel like if I were to be so broad, it really is the issue of, like, what does equity look like? I think we're at a moment, and just I've been reflecting on this as of late, it feels like one of the ills of white supremacy is the ability to take away our space as Black people to imagine and to engage in serious imagination. An example that I use really randomly is that Sir Isaac Newton must have been so bored and so unencumbered to have come up with calculus.
That's brilliant.
And I think of the fact that feeling of being unencumbered hasn't been granted to us. And so really, I think the biggest question is a question of imagination, because we're no longer engaging in conversations on what's the quickest reform, but we're engaging in conversations on what's the next sustainable change that's going to drastically shift how we do everything. And as we engage in the new normal, I feel like the idea of protecting space to imagine for this next iteration of the world to be inclusive is a pressing and dire issue.
Yeah, and privilege is not having to eat that apple that falls on your head.
Right. You created an entire course of study based on something you couldn't even see.
Exactly.
And somebody funded that?
But that was, 400, 500 years ago? How long ago was that?